much. Now, 10 years on from the financial crisis, we're still learning lessons from one of the biggest economic crashes in history. And getting the right balance between regulation and laissez-faire has been one of the key challenges facing governments and the market. But have industries historically been more successful at self-regulating themselves than regulators ever have been? Joining us now to discuss from New York is Edward Stringham, president of the American Institute for Economic Research. Edward, delighted to have you on the program. Thank you so much for joining us. You've written a book about private governance. So I want to ask you, is it that you think government regulation doesn't work, or just that it hasn't been done correctly since the financial crisis?
I think there was this huge knee-jerk reaction 10 years ago where people thought, oh my goodness, what's going on? And they just added regulation after regulation, not actually considering the long-run costs of these regulations and how they're going to affect financial markets, and also not looking at the history that we've had with alternatives to it. So I don't think we need to just have this knee-jerk reaction and say, there's a problem, let's add a bunch of rules, more and more rules, more and more red tape is not the answer to me.
So what is the answer if we're looking at lessons from history then? How could regulators have done this better?
Sure, yeah. So when I look back in history, there's actually plenty of rules and regulations that actually come from the markets themselves. So we can think about the invisible hand as the analogy, Adam Smith's analogy about the market, but actually producing rules and regulations. So if you look at the history of markets like the London Stock Exchange, it originally was a coffee house, Jonathan's Coffee House, that started creating private rules and regulations to create reliability. They would put the names of defaulters on a chalkboard in Jonathan's Coffee House. They eventually turned it into a private club where only reliable people could be a member. And then they adopted eventually as their motto, my word is my bond.
That's fascinating. And Edward, I totally take your point, but we've gone way beyond the era of chalkboards. Global financial markets now are so much bigger and so much more complex. How on earth can individuals self-regulate when markets are global and complex?
Sure, and that's one of the roles of self-regulatory organizations today. The London Stock Exchange is far more complex than it was as a coffee house. New York Stock Exchange, but we've got plenty of these private regulatory bodies. ISDA, the International Swaps and Derivatives Association, they actually manage people's contracts for these very complex derivatives contract to say, if you're going to have this type of contract, here are the conditions that you need to follow to become a member of this, to have an ISDA agreement. You've got to have certain capital requirements. They talked about that in a lot of people probably saw the movie The Big Short, where the characters are dejected because they can't get this ISDA agreement, and it's like, oh, you know, actually we're not really serious people. So there's plenty of things, futures markets, the commodities exchanges, these things, the New York Mercantile Exchange, they actually manage counterparty default risk. So when you're a member of the New York Mercantile Exchange and you make a contract with somebody else, the exchange is actually assuming counterparty default risk. They're managing the contract between the two parties. So yes, it is tremendously complex, and we have a lot more private rules and regulations than we actually ever have.
Yeah, Ed, and I mean, I certainly understand the idea of counterparty default risk, and banks certainly do that as well. But if regulation wasn't really needed and financial markets, financial participants were able to regulate themselves effectively, why did we have the global financial crash?
So I think it was a very complicated set of factors. A lot of it, I would say, was associated with monetary policy, also including government regulations where they were mandating increases in loans to people who might otherwise not be able to afford homes. And the banks are simply just responding to the regulatory requirement. In addition, we had increases in accounting regulations, mark-to-market accounting rules, and the banks are just going along with it. The interest rate environment changed. We had a big uptick in interest rates. That was not due to banks. That was due to government monetary policy. And then all of a sudden the banks are in the situation, well, okay, the economy's changing and people are starting to default. I wouldn't blame the banks. I wouldn't blame lack of regulation on that. These people were just responding to market conditions. The banks were just victims, I would say. They were exhibiting symptoms, but they actually didn't cause the disease of increasing interest rates, which led to a lot of these defaults on mortgages.
Will we have safer and more efficient markets in 10 years' time to the point that we can avoid a crisis like the last one?
I can predict with 100% certainty that there's going to be some fluctuations, and no matter how many government regulations we have, unfortunately, it's not going to prevent the next economic downturn. And I would say the same thing. I'm a big fan of private rules and regulations, private governance, but I think there's going to be fluctuations from time to time, and that's just going to be a factor. We cannot legislate it out of our existence, and that's sad. It's a fact of the world, though. We cannot eliminate fluctuations in markets or any type of system that we can dream up.
Thank you so much. Edward Stringham, president of the American Institute for Economic Research and author of Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life. Great to have you with us. Now, up next.